The Effects of Child Abuse and Neglect is brought to you by Texel, your credit union, with locations in Temple, Belton, and Killeen. Visit us at texel.org.
May the face of the Lord shine on you. May He shower His blessing on all that you do. May you never know anguish, sorrow, or strife. Dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of your life.
Howdy, I'm Sue Ellen Jackson, and this is Aware Central Texas, Effects of Child Abuse Neglect. You might want to stay with us for the next few minutes. We're going to be talking about domestic violence. We're going to be hearing from a couple of ladies that have experienced it. You're also going to be hearing from my two guests. I have a police officer here with me, and I have a director of a family violence shelter where the families go if they need to get away from someone because of domestic violence. So go grab a glass of tea or a cup of coffee and sit down with us. Join us for this conversation. Hi, I'm so glad y'all are here. I have with me my friend Dave Haley, who is a police officer. And Dave, you also do a lot of community education. I know you're very passionate about this topic. And we have Suzanne Armour, who is also very passionate about what she does, and she is providing shelter for victims of domestic violence. So we should have a very interesting next few minutes. Dave, if you didn't know anything about domestic violence, what does it look like?
Domestic violence is something that covers everything. It can be anything from verbal abuse to actual physical abuse. A lot of people think it's only when they see the cuts, the scratches, the bruises, the spouse at the hospital, but there's a lot of mental abuse and mistreatment that goes on that's never reported.
So the scenario is, it looks like, and it's not always dad. You know, we tend to assume that dad's the one that's the perpetrator, and it's not always that way. But the children are growing up in an environment where they're seeing mom and dad, or mom and significant other, or dad and significant other actually screaming at each other. It may come to blows, or they may not be screaming. They may be whispering threats in each other's ears.
That's right.
And the children are picking up on this. They're abused.
They are, and they become part of this vicious circle that continues on. And another thing that we need to make sure people understand is it's not just the parents, or it's not just the low-income families, because abuse doesn't know any economic boundaries. It's every race, color, creed, and from the richest to the poorest. It has no boundaries.
Right. Suzanne, you see that, don't you?
Absolutely, and I think it's also very important to note that, as you were saying, even if the kids don't directly witness an actual act of violence, they feel the tension and they feel the stress in the home, and sometimes that's a lot worse than actually seeing a violent act occur.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, that must be a really scary way to grow up. In a way, it seems like it might almost be worse because they're scared and they don't really know why. And so they might be imagining things that are even worse than what they're experiencing. It's a vicious situation.
It really disrupts their sense of safety.
And it destroys the whole family. And it destroys the whole family, which leads to that whole neighborhood. So it's very important that people understand just how destructive this can be to their community, and start to speak out when they need to about it and contact people.
Absolutely. That is so important. If you even think that there's some family violence going on in your home, and I know we talked earlier about the fact that if people grow up in that type of toxic situation where families scream at each other and pow on each other once in a while, they may not even realize that you don't have to live like that. you know, you can learn to enjoy and appreciate the people in your home. It's a lot of work. And if generation after generation after generation, this is all you've ever known, I want to challenge you to rethink that. You know, there are better ways of living, and there is always hope. We have a couple of brave souls who have been willing to share their story about domestic violence, and let's hear what Lisa has to say about her experience with domestic violence.
My experience with domestic violence first started with my parents. Believe it or not, my dad was not very abusive to my mom until I got older. I'm gonna say about 9 or 10 was the first time I first started experiencing it. I can remember him, my mom jumping in the van and him just driving off, but she was stuck in the door and he drug her. There's a lot of things. He would hit her in front of everybody at parties. And one of his best friends just took him and threw him and all the way across the yard, and he landed in one of the little metal pails. I can remember this to this day. You know, I can remember, you know, the cops making us go and stand across the road until things settled down. That's part of the stuff when I was younger. Then it repeated itself when I got married with my husband. He wasn't severely abusive because I didn't allow it to happen. I always knew that there was, like, I'm gonna call it a trend, but that a pattern, it repeats itself. So I always knew that in the back of my head, and I always knew that I would not allow it to happen. But it happened once where he decided, well, it wasn't more to me, it was more to my children that he was abusive to. And when my kids he was supposed to have visitation with my children, and his girlfriend decided he wasn't going to visit with my kids, so if he didn't come home to her house, she was going to kick him out. So he decided he was going to leave, and the kids started screaming and running down the road, and they grabbed onto the side of one of the mirrors on his truck. And boy, oh boy, did Mom go crazy, because he wasn't stopping. I mean, he was going slow, but he was trying to get him off. But that was definitely not the way to go in front of me. So what happened was I decided I jumped in the truck, and I tried to turn his keys to throw him out the window into the woods. And he grabbed me by my throat, and he had pushed me up against the truck. And I thought that night I was gonna die. But I don't know, I think I got strength from God, because my one son had bit him in the behind. And all of a sudden I pushed him back, and I grabbed him by his neck and I twisted it. And I said, "You're not gonna hurt these babies. I will kill you." And more so, I think at that point in time, I was the domestic violencer, but it didn't matter. It was me repeating some of the stuff that my parents had done. But he wasn't gonna abuse my children. And that's where I had to come into, you know, becoming violent at that point at myself. I had to protect my children, you know, and at all costs. It didn't matter whether I was going to kill him or not. But I ended up having to live with his mom. He took off with my children, and I had to live with his mom. And that's when he was becoming more abusive to the boys. And that's when I decided I had to go into the shelter or something in Pennsylvania is where I ended up. And then I ended up moving here to Texas because there wasn't a whole lot there. You know, there was no housing or anything like that. It took years to get on housing. It was like 8 or 9 years where I could come here and get it. So this is where I got the help. I couldn't get it in my own state.
Lisa's a very brave soul to share that story. And did y'all notice as she was talking about her parents were violent And then she got into it with her husband, and then her son got involved.
Yes. And that's part of the cycle that we were talking about earlier, about how it goes through and from one generation to the next. And if it's not broken, how it'll continue to follow through one generation to the next.
Right. How do you break that?
I think the key is learning about healthy relationships, and we talk a lot about prevention, and if someone has never had a healthy relationship modeled for them, they don't know how to act any other way than what they've already seen. And you know, so it almost looks like it's almost infected the entire family, where she saw it with her folks, and now she's sometimes reacting that way, her son is reacting that way, and the only way to break that is to really examine what is a healthy relationship, and how can I change my communication patterns, and how can I express myself differently. And
Unfortunately, I think Lisa is the exception to the rule, because a lot of women, and even men, maybe even more so, men keep it in. You know, that old country song, Behind Closed Doors. Why is that? What needs to happen to cause that victim to say, I've had it, you know?
Well, I think one of the things that I think our department's pretty active in is making sure that the people understand that they're a victim. There's nothing worth going through an abusive relationship, that they're a victim, and that they need to step forward, realize that, and get the guidance or help that they or their family needs.
Right. When they come to you, Suzanne, and I know that you, in our conversation earlier, that you're very sensitive to understand that we're not passing judgment here.
Right.
There's a real good possibility that that perpetrator has some of his or her own abuse history, and they're living out their own cycle. Doesn't make it okay, but we're not passing judgment. But when they come to you afraid and scared, and these little children are huddling, and you know, their eyes are big, and they're like, what's going to happen? Is my mommy going to be okay? And how do you break through to cause them to understand how important it would be to go ahead and press charges? You know, I know they're worried about groceries. You know, there's a lot of obstacles when you get caught up in that cycle.
Well, one of the things you have to do is remind them that they do have options, that we are there to help, that it takes time to get back on your feet. A lot of times when someone's been in this situation, they've been made to believe that they can't make it on their own. And it's absolutely not true, they can, but their self-esteem has been so impacted by all this negative feedback that a lot of times it just feels hopeless. So we try to make them aware of their options. We work on self-esteem. We let them realize that they did nothing to deserve this, that no one deserves to be hurt.
That's a biggie too, because
Yes, exactly.
the perpetrator a lot of times will say, you made me do this.
Made me
Why
do
are you
this?"
making me do this?
And really, he or she, whoever the perpetrator is in control of their own emotions. And it's not the victim's fault, ever.
I've been learning more and more about domestic violence, and another component of that I've been hearing about is the emotional control that's levied on the victim. And so, like you were saying, the self-esteem is taken away. So now these people are just depleted emotionally. They've been removed from their home. He or she was the paycheck. How's my rent going to get paid? I got to buy school supplies to get my kids in school. I don't even have money for diapers.
Right.
Exactly.
Where am I going to go? Where am I going to live? It's just overwhelming, and you're dealing with a person that's already been broken.
And that's one of the problems that any officer or law enforcement agency has when responding to a call like this, because you're dealing with somebody who has no self-esteem. They've been pulled out of their families. They've been made to think that all their friends, their family are against them, and that spouse is the only thing that they have. So when an officer goes into a situation like that where maybe the spouse is arrested, then you automatically become the enemy, because you've taken everything that means anything to her, regardless of whether that person was in a very abusive situation or not. You're still taking her only support. So it puts the police in a very difficult situation, along with the counselors that have to follow through with with that, because they're also part of that system that they believe is a cause for her being in the situation she's now, because her support was taken from her.
How do y'all deal with that? I know you, Dave, better than you, Suzanne, but I see it on you, and I know you're this way too. Y'all aren't doing this for the money. I mean, you're in your profession because you care. So you're seeing this on a regular basis. And how do you take that home? How do you separate yourself from that?
A lot of times it is very depressing, but we also get to see how absolutely resilient people can be. And you see someone come through that door and the kids are scared and mom just looks like she's got the weight of the world on her. And little by little you see the kids kind of brighten up a little bit, and maybe mom goes out and gets a job, gets her GED, and before you know it, these people that came in at the worst time of their lives are, after 30, 45 days are ready to go out and start a new life. And they're in such a better place than they were when they got there. And so I try to remember that.
That's great.
Exactly. In fact, that's I think that's one of the things that keeps a lot of us going when we deal with this on a basis that we do, especially as times are getting harder and money's getting tighter in the home. After 15 years, I've seen that cycle after it stopped, and you see that things can improve and people can get better. And the children that were afraid of you at one time now call you Officer Dave instead of running away.
So you build those relationships.
So you have those relationships, and you're able to see an end to that means. So you know that the system works if you can get enough people involved and get them started. That's what's so important about having a place for the families to go.
Yeah. So there is hope. If you're a victim, you need to understand that there is hope. There's folks out there like Dave and Suzanne, and they care, and you can get through this. Don't let your life be destroyed by a cycle that can be broken. A scenario that I've heard you mention, you go to a scene, you're called to a domestic violence scene, and oh, they're going at it, now you've separated mom and dad and the kids are huddled over, like Lisa was talking about, across the street.
In the corner, in the closet.
Right, and big-eyed and, shook up, and you take dad or mom or whoever off to jail, and then the next day it's her job to go in and press charges, and she changes her mind.
Yes, and unfortunately it used to be that we didn't have too much leeway there. Now, if we see that there's actually been physical harm done, it's not a question of that we may, it says we will.
Right.
And if the spouse doesn't press charges, we will, because the law allows us to do that now. Anytime there's physical violence in the home, where we can actually see that.
Well, that's a start.
And it is a start, because that has given us the power to get these people the help they need, regardless of whether they want it or not. Because as I was saying, a lot of times these victims, it becomes a norm to them.
Right.
And until they're actually forced to get outside that norm, they don't realize what the norm really is. So by allowing us to get in there and break this cycle for them, and hopefully get them the help they need, even the abusive spouse, it's been a great tool for us to use.
We have another lady that is going to share her story, and this is a little different. She experienced domestic violence and was caught up in that cycle, and she was able to break it. So let's hear from her.
I experienced abuse at a very young age in a past relationship. He was someone I knew throughout my school years. He was very popular, At the school, all the girls thought he was so fine. He was very good at sports. He would always compare me to other girls, which later I developed low self-esteem, and I became very insecure. I didn't feel pretty enough. He made me feel like if I didn't give him sex when he wanted to, then he would go get it from someone else. So I felt like, well, I have to have sex with him, or he'll go get it from someone else. What I didn't know is he was already getting it from someone else. I thought I was in love. I thought he loved me. There was an incident I recall that occurred at my home while my sister was present, and he pushed me into the corner of a bedpost. And I hit my head, and I thought I was going to pass out or die. I blamed myself. I thought it was something I did because he was very jealous, he was very controlling, and I wasn't at home around a certain time. So maybe it was my fault. I stayed in the relationship thinking, oh, okay, it's just love. It was okay. You know, he'll change. Besides, if I break up with him, then somebody else will have him. And I didn't want anybody else to have him because I thought I was in love. Later, I found myself being tossed around like a rag doll in the home of one of his relatives, in front of his family member, including our daughter, who was 2 years old at the time. I knew I had to make a choice. I had to make a change. Instead of waiting for him to change, I changed by choosing life over death. I would like to encourage anyone who is suffering from abuse or who has suffered from abuse in the past that you are someone, you have a choice, you have a purpose, and you have a voice. I am now serving as a volunteer with Aware Central Texas. Aware Central Texas offer programs, support groups, and counseling services for victims of abuse or who have suffered from abuse in the past. I encourage you to seek help. Contact Aware Central Texas. Aware Central Texas has a saying, to the world, you are one person, but to one person, you are the world.
It takes a lot of courage to share information that could possibly affect your children, family members, but this young lady wanted to let it be known what she went through in the hopes that possibly she's going to be the very person that helps somebody else break that cycle of violence. It's hard though. People, we understand, and we've talked about the fact that people are afraid for a lot of reasons to get out of a situation that is detrimental to them and their children. But we haven't really talked about the emotional aspects of wanting to stay in that cycle. And I'm just a person in the neighborhood. I'm not a therapist or a brilliant person, but I've heard that people that are caught up in domestic violence cycles are ashamed.
They're very ashamed, and they're made to believe that certain things can't happen, or that they're not able to do those things. And that's one of the terrible things about being caught up into that cycle where you're taken away from your family, your friends, and put in your own little world to the point where you have no self-esteem, you have no self-worth. And they're given information like, I'll harm your children if you leave. And they're made to believe this, that they just cannot survive without that spouse.
Right. That's part of that mind control.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a bunch of TV stations that have movies geared toward women, and all too often the women are the victims and the guys are the bad guys, and you know they basically the same scenario, different movie, and they're sometimes they're impoverished, low education, and then sometimes they're fancy and they live in a big fancy house, and their prominent husband, who's whatever, is actually quite the nasty person.
Exactly.
Do you see more impoverished people or more middle class people or more wealthy people come in? I would think that people that have resources would have other escape routes.
Yeah.
That's why we usually see, and you usually see in the papers, more of the lower income families, because other families have the money to go
Yes.
other routes.
Yes, for example, going into a shelter might be a last resort for someone, where someone who might have more adequate means might be able to use the credit card and go to a hotel. But
Exactly.
certainly anyone, regardless of their level of income, their education, whatever, if they have a safety issue, they can end up in a shelter, and we see it all the time because it is safer that way.
Sure.
There are certainly no boundaries to who this can happen to.
Well, and I can imagine that if you're a prominent person in the neighborhood or in the community, that if you've got some little nastiness going on at the house, you're going to do whatever you have to do to keep that covered up
Exactly.
for a lot of different reasons. That's so sad because people are trapped in their own homes.
They get trapped in their home, in their own community, and a lot of times no one but maybe, and it's not very often, that even their neighbors know what's going on.
Right.
Or their
So-
extended family. We hide it from people whose opinion matters to us.
That's right,
Right.
because we become ashamed of what's really going on in our neighborhood, or what's going on in my home, and I don't want anybody to know about it. So this young lady was extremely fortunate and extremely brave to say that I'm going to do something to make it better for me and my children, and by stepping forward, she actually did.
Yes, and that was a brave thing. And I don't know the statistics. You may know more of this than I do. I don't know how many families choose to live in this over and over again, and what the percentage is of people that actually can move away from that cycle.
Well, the average, a woman will leave an average of 7 times before they leave permanently.
Wow. I
Because the
did not know
process
that.
is so difficult.
That's exactly
Because you're
right.
dealing with all layers and
Yes.
layers of obstacles.
Yes, and there are so many obstacles that sometimes it's just easier, it feels easier just to give up and go back into an unsafe situation, simply because it's exhausting. And no one's all bad all the time, we tell ourselves.
And the reality is, it may be the death of you.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a violent situation, you need to understand that you could be killed. Your kids could be killed. Don't think it couldn't happen. It happens in
That's
our
right.
neighborhood,
Every day.
and it can happen in yours. But there's always hope. I want to thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
I've learned a lot today, and I thought I knew something about it before, and I know more now. Please give us a call if you need help. The number is 254-939-7582. Thank you.
May the face of the Lord shine on you. May He shower His blessing on all that you do. May you never know anguish, sorrow, or strife. Dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of your life.
The Effects of Child Abuse and Neglect is brought to you by Texel, your credit union, with locations in Temple, Belton, and Killeen. Visit us at texel.org.